So as we resume a review of our assignments and solutions, much of the work that you would do for the virtual lab course is structured in the modules, and it's self-paced. And so certainly you can read the study guide and get into the textbook, right? So if we're looking at the textbook assignment, it says chapters 1 through 3, pages 1 through 31. And I did want to call out some specifics in each of those, in some of those pages, in selected diagrams and such. There are some differences, and this is creating some difficulties. The other purpose for today is to begin to review what we're going to do for our Module 1 solution. And you'll actually have a choice between creating a server virtual machine or a Linux virtual machine. And I know the whole point of this textbook is to work within Microsoft's wheelhouse. But in any case, what you're looking at here is a Kindle app that I use to work with my electronic books, you see. And so I have so many different ones. There was a time where I was part of the Amazon Kindle subscription. So for $10 a month, a number of these were free. And so there are a number of books that are really helpful. The Mastering Windows Server 2019, actually Mastering Windows Server, the original version from 2012, written by Manassi, is considered one of the world's best Windows references for system administrators and for help desk support personnel. So it's dated because it's 2012, and there are more recent versions of this that are written by other people. But Mark Manassi has a way of explaining the internals of Windows in a way that's really rare and clear and understandable. This book in particular, I find very helpful. So in chapter 1, it basically gives you a quick understanding of what virtualization is really all about. And for some of you, you may have had some orientation about this, but there are others in our class joining us asynchronously because they're watching the recording. And we did have some students ask, okay, if I'm following along in the textbook, it's walking through some setup for the course. And then if I'm following along in the assignments, there's some different things going on there. And I wanted to reconcile that as cleanly as possible. So this assignment here is designed to prepare your personal technology so that it's capable of working. These are the initial logistical steps that you need in order to get the tools on hand so that you can follow through and actually implement the solution. So this prepares your hardware and your operating system, and this lays hold of the raw installation media and the virtual VirtualBox environment. But then as you follow along here, one thing you'll notice is that there's a version difference between the two. So when you're downloading here, it's Server 2022. And when you're following along here, you're going to see that it's talking about older versions of the server, right? In simple terms, we want to create the kind of real estate on your personal technology that allows you to run a computer within a computer. In a nutshell, virtual systems or virtual machines are virtual representations of all of the hardware components found in a real computer. So if we look at And I may have shown you this before, and please stop me if I've already shown you this. And let me update our roster here. So Kevin has joined us. Welcome, Kevin. So if we right click where it says my computer or this computer and we go to manage, have I or have I not shown you the device manager? Hello?
Yes.
I wouldn't know. I missed the last class.
Okay, so I'm getting a mixed response. This is a utility in Windows that you can access through computer management, and sometimes there are other ways to get to this, but essentially it shows you what you have loaded inside your physical hardware. So if I'm looking here, one of the things you'll notice is that I have a generic Intel high definition graphics controller that's part of the processor, right? So I have an Intel i5 CPU, and that i5 processor has 4 cores, 4 physical cores, actually 2 physical cores, and they're hyper-threaded, so they're kind of doubled. So I have 4 CPU cores to work with, or 4 CPU processors. So built into this i5, this Intel i5 is a graphics controller. And that's just a very common thing for business class laptops. If I look at my disk drives, it tells me what kind of hard drive I have. And the simple truth is that each of these components are represented in memory and RAM. When you start up your computer, in order for your software to be able to access each of these physical resources, it creates a version of that hardware device in memory. It's a virtual replication or virtual duplication of the physical device. So we take the functionality of that physical device, and if it's a keyboard or a mouse, we recreate another keyboard in random access memory inside the RAM chips. And the reason we do that in general is because the world is full of different brands. This is a ThinkPad, a Lenovo ThinkPad, but there are people who use MacBooks and people who use HPs and Chromebooks, and they're all different. All the hardware is different. And in order for the software we're running to speak a common language, how could you create software that works on every system if you were bogged down with writing different procedures to access different hard drives? So the trick is you have all these different hard drives, and this one's a Samsung with 256 gigs of solid state hard drive space. And that's a different kind of hard drive than we had when this machine was first purchased 10 years ago, right? So I put a solid state hard drive in here, and now it's like a whole new machine. This is a 10-year-old laptop, right? But the software that I'm running is a Windows 10. And when I bought this thing a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, they were running Windows 7 or Windows XP, right? How is it you can run on all of those different types and brands and models and the stuff doesn't crash? Well, the operating system creates a hypothetical disk drive, a hypothetical display adapter or graphics controller, a hypothetical processor. And it wasn't long before computer scientists realized, wait a minute, we can do this with all of the RAM and the disk space and just recreate multiples of different computer systems, right? And so this idea, what we found out is that the hardware industry has outstripped the software side of technology by centuries. We are almost, in terms of practical development, we're about 1,000 years ahead in terms of hardware than we are in the software world. Put another way, there was a comparison that was made between computers and cars. Did I share this with you? That if the automotive industry had progressed the same way the hardware industry has progressed, you could buy like $1 million Lamborghini or a Bugatti or a Ferrari, right? You could buy like $1 million race car, or if you want something that's luxurious, Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, right? $500,000 car. You could purchase it for $0.25, for 25 cents. It would run 1 million miles on a single gallon of gas, and it would go from 0 to 60 in 1/10 of a second, right? So if cars progressed the same way computers did, that's the world we would live in. You would have flying cars probably, right? And the simple truth is that you have all of this physical capacity, but in the world today, we need more computing power. So one of the things they found out is that you can create this virtual machine on top of the hardware. So here's a representation, right, of what this looks like. You have a physical host, which would be like my Lenovo laptop. And by the way, are there any questions so far before we continue? Any questions?
Would there be a difference between an Intel processor and a Ryzen processor?
That's a great question. The short answer is yes, there are important differences. So the question was, is there a difference between an Intel processor and a Ryzen AMD processor? And conceptually, in terms of how the operating system works, you could say, well, those are minor differences and not really. When it comes to how they operate or what they do on the hardware level, the differences are significant. The important thing to understand is that because of the hypervisor or because of the operating system, right, Windows will take the Ryzen-based gaming system and it'll look just like this one. It'll have the same list of digital components, and those are all virtual devices, right? And it'll show processors here. And when you're working with CPU tasks and you need the processor, it's going to look like every other processor. So there's this homogenization or generalization, like a universal translator, yeah? And that's what an operating system does. Now, getting back to the hardware, if the hardware has progressed so far in the hardware industry, we have the capacity to do a lot more with our technology. So you have the physical host, and if you run something like VirtualBox or VMware, those are specialized software programs that are called hypervisors. And they function a good bit like an operating system. They create a virtual layer on top of the hardware, and then you can set up a Mac machine. You can have an Apple computer running next to a Linux computer running, next to a Kali computer running, next to a Windows machine running, next to an Android machine running. You can have all of these virtual computers running at the same time. Now, those virtual machines are called guests, all right? And what's important to understand is that this guest does not know about this guest, and the two of these don't know about the third guest, and the three of these don't know about the fourth guest. They're all isolated. They're all independent, as if they were physically different. So if you took physical hosts and duplicated those for this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, you'd have the same effect, basically. Now, where do you get in trouble? This is the download from the Microsoft website. And in our last class, I recorded that you would have to pull up the properties of this file when it was finished downloading. It is 5.16 gigabytes large, and that's just the installation media. What's significant about this is if you downloaded it correctly and it was not corrupted when it copied into your hard drive, it should be exactly 5,550,684,160 bytes large. And that's what you should submit for your assignment. Now notice I'm using the owner login, which is why my downloads folder is unique. This is my user profile. So this screenshot, when I capture it, it's unique to my system alone. You should have a file that ends in 620 Delta 7 Echo Alpha Charlie. That means DEAC. Any questions so far about what you should download for the 1.3 assignment? So last week, I said you're going to take a screenshot of those properties, and that's one of the things that you're going to paste in there. In your Notepad file, you downloaded the activation key that you use. Now, here's the problem. For some students and for some instructors, when I install this software to do my 1.4 solution for our first module, I'm going to be building an entire new server on top of my laptop. So I have a laptop hardware here, and then I'm running VirtualBox instead of VMware. But then right here is going to be a Microsoft Server Data Center installation or a Microsoft Server Standard installation. And that's going to be like a server, like a full-scale server, like as in a data center, go to Google or Amazon or one of those companies and visit their data center, go to the rack and go inside and look at these big physical machines. That same thing is going to be running inside here in this little corner of memory. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it. The problem is when I look at how much room I have, if you do the same on yours, you're going to need about 40 gigabytes of drive space. And even when I performed assignment 1.2 and did all of this to maximize my disk space and to clean up the unused apps and to do all those things, what I ended up with was only about 20 gigs of free space. So remember, I had a 256 gig solid state hard drive. Now I also have a thumb drive that I've plugged in. It's a 128 gig thumb drive, and I formatted this, right? And what I've done is I've taken a virtual machine from another class. This is the virtual machine I created for my scientific computing applications class, CSC 238. It's about 20 gigs large, and I've made a copy of it on my thumb drive. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select my VM folder, and I'm going to select my VM machine after I've created it in here, and I'm going to right-click it and delete it. And it's going to say, hey, it's too big to recycle. Are you sure you want to delete it? Well, I have an extra copy on a thumb drive, so I'm going to say yes. Now, do I have more disk space? Well, technically, yes, I have 39.1 gigabytes, but if I really want to use that space, what I have to do is go out to my recycle bin. Half the time you delete things, you have to empty the recycle bin, or it really doesn't appear there. The reason it didn't appear here, I mean, it did appear here, is because that one folder was way too large. Now I need 36 gigabytes minimum to install my virtual machine. And because I've downloaded, in my downloads folder, I have downloaded the Windows Server install media, I can walk through the installation of my server. And it's going to track somewhat with what I have in the book, except in the book, they're using Windows 10, I think, instead of Windows Server. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this so that you see the steps that you would follow to set up a virtual machine, similar to the way you set up a virtual machine following the book. Okay. And if you do both, let's say that you're a student who just wants to do it all and explore it all, you can post what you did from the book, and you can post what you did from Blackboard, and I promise you that will not be a wasted effort. I will be happy to post additional credit, generous additional credit, for the extra steps that you took to explore and try different things. Okay? Did everybody just hear that?
Yes.
Okay. So you can do just what's required here, and that's cool. But you can do more. And the assignment that we're going to post doesn't ask you to follow the textbook explicitly. But the textbook is helpful in this case because it's going to tell you some things. It'll give you some perspective about how virtual machines work. And then when you install the Windows machine, it'll give you tips and pointers about how to use your VirtualBox better, right? So you're going to install VirtualBox. Now, let's talk about your case. I have a 5.16 gigabyte install file. And as soon as I set up my virtual machine, I can delete this. Or if I'm smart, I'll put an extra copy somewhere where I can use it in the future. And then I have extra space. I'd have 5 gigs more. So if I was worried about whether or not I had enough space, I need 36 gigabytes minimum in order to install. And what may happen is that I go through the install and it says, oh, no, you don't have enough disk space. So that may happen actually. If it does, we're not going to panic. I'm going to go ahead and take care of this and give you a second option. But I'd like to go ahead and finish walking through some of the things in the textbook also. And then I also want to call out that you're supposed to be reading the study guide. So don't forget that inside references, there's a Module 1 study guide, and it's very important that you read from start to finish that study guide to prepare for the Module 1 assessment, right? It's also going to help you with your solution. So after our class is over, before the day is out, I'm going to post the 1.4 solution. But let's go ahead and walk through this yet. So remember, you have a physical machine and then you have virtual machines, and that's the context, right? Now, the piece of software that sits between the guest computers and the physical host is called the hypervisor. And there are 2 kinds of hypervisors. We'll talk about that in just a moment. What you need to understand is that the virtualization that we're talking about is becoming an industry trend that's huge. It's changing the entire landscape of technology everywhere in the world. And that's because we can run multiple servers, and those multiple servers can use the hypervisor to create a virtualization layer like the hypervisor, okay? Except now it's multiple physical machines. See, so here we only had 1 host, but here we have server 1, server 2, server 3, and these look like pizza boxes. This is the front edge of the server, and you slide these into a rack. So there's a closet, and it has rails on it, and those little notches allow you to slide it into the rack. And you have a server, a server, a server, and these are huge. Each of these have CPUs that dwarf gaming machines. You know, there's 64 cores in the CPUs. There's 256 gigs of RAM. There's 27 terabytes of disk space. There's all this stuff, right, in each of these boxes. But we run that hypervisor, and the hypervisor creates a virtualization layer. And what that allows our technology people to do is create web server, web server, web server, email server, email server, email server, database server, database server, database server, network server, network server, network server, and so on. And then they can run at the same time with the same set of information. So if one of them fails, they keep on going. It's hugely important. The thing to remember is that the virtualization layer can happen between machines and not just on a single physical device. Does everybody hear that?
Yes.
All right. Now, why?
Can you repeat that? Sorry about that.
Yeah. No. The thing to remember is that the hypervisor can be used to create a virtualization layer that works between physical machines, not just on one single machine. That's the important thing to understand. Okay.
Thank you.
This tip is really important. Let's pretend that I only have 16 gigs of RAM and 500 gigs of hard drive space and an i5 with 4 cores of CPU. Can I create and run 6 virtual machines that have and use simultaneously 128 gigs of RAM, 3 terabytes of drive space, and 6 different 8-core processors? Do you think that would be possible if the physical host only has 4 physical cores in the CPU, only has really, I mean, in terms of real memory, 16 gigs, and only 500 gigs of hard drive space? Do you think it would be possible to do that?
No.
The short answer is no. That's correct. Another thing that you have to watch for is that a physical host can run a virtual server or a virtual machine, and that virtual machine can run another virtual machine inside it. But that's as far as it goes. And they don't even really recommend that. So that's one of the limitations that it talks about in the textbook. And you're going to see that as an assessment item on your Module 1 assessment. I'm going to have a scenario and I'm going to say, hey, somebody's trying to set up all these virtual machines and this is what they have. What's wrong? And the answer is, you can't use what you don't have. If you only have 16 gigs of RAM, you can't set up 10 virtual machines with 32 gigs each. It's not a magic box, right? It's not a magic box. You have to keep an eye on the shared resources. You can only share the physical resources that exist. And if you go beyond that, it won't be able to handle it. Now, why VirtualBox? VirtualBox is one of the few hypervisor applications that it's free. Did I mention it's free? Did I explain that you
Sorry, quick question.
Yes.
When you're setting it up, isn't it supposed to be also, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, isn't it not supposed to be set up to make sure that you don't consume all the space of RAM?
Yes and no. Okay, so the question was, when you're setting this up, are you supposed to be sure you don't consume all the RAM? We're going to show you exactly how to do that. Okay, so as we walk through the solution, you'll be able to see exactly how we control that. That's a great question. I'm going to show you that in just a little bit. Okay, so hold that thought. All right, now one of the things about VirtualBox that's so special is that it can run a Mac, it can run Linux machines, it can run Windows machines. VirtualBox is one of the few that are open source that are free. But then more importantly, there aren't very many free choices. Most of the virtual machine hypervisors that are used for workplace environments cost money, lots of money. And VMware is one of them, very expensive. Windows started including a free one called Hyper-V, but it only works on Windows. There's one that you could use that's like a trial version for the Mac, but it's only free for a time, right? The point is that VirtualBox is one of the few that you can install on any of these machines, and that's a real benefit. So that's one reason why we're using it for our course primarily. Now, you may find that the machine you're running with doesn't like VirtualBox. If you have a Mac and it's a new Mac with the M1 processor, a RISC processor, wicked fast. Some of the versions of VirtualBox that have been out recently just don't run on it, but you can get a different software package called Parallels. You just have to pay a little money for it. About the same that you'd pay for a good meal in a restaurant, right? Now, one of the things about virtualization benefits that we want to make sure are very clear to everybody. A typical server can cost 10 grand. But let's say that you have a very nice server, and let's say that you buy a really good one, okay? I'm sorry about that pop-up. Let's say that we have a very powerful server and we spent $20,000 on it. With that $20,000 server, I can run 10 virtual machines, 10 virtual servers, which would otherwise cost $10,000 each times 10 servers. If I did it physically, it would cost $100,000. But because I'm using a $20,000 physical server and it's powerful, and then I use VMware, or I use VirtualBox, or I use Hyper-V, now I can run 10 different servers on that one machine. And instead of spending what I would do 10 times 10,000, that's 100,000. Instead of spending $100,000, I'm only spending 20,000, okay? So cost savings is huge. Another reason for virtualizing is that computer management is easier. A lot of times hardware components fail. But if your systems that you depend on are virtualized, you can switch out the hardware components and the rest of it keeps running if you set it up correctly. If you set it up correctly. Did I mention you have to set it up correctly? If that's the case, when something goes bad in terms of the physical hardware, if it's set up correctly, you can swap it out and the virtual machines go right on running and nobody knows any different. Experimentation is another reason why virtual machines are becoming so important. If I set up a virtual machine for my assignment and I screw it up, I can click a button and it'll unscrew it up. It's like an undo button for an entire server. So what does that mean? I can experiment. I can try things, and if it doesn't work out, I can just roll back to what I did before I tried it. Experimentation is huge, which means if you're not working with virtual machines, you're missing out. Now, these are the primary advantages of working with virtual systems. Are there any questions before we get into, all right, so hardware management is a benefit, backing up systems to keep your data safe. Those are also by extension similar benefits, and this is in your textbook. And that's the end of chapter 1. Now here it talks about how to get started with VirtualBox in chapter 2. And you'll notice it's version 6.1.0. Right now we're on version 6.1.36. So if you're in VirtualBox today, we went from 0 to 36, okay? So for our intent and purposes, if you're following along with the book, you're not doing 0, you're doing 36. Any questions about that? So here it talks about the minimum that you need. I told you that 36 gigabytes of disk space are required to load a server operating system, right? And it says, since it's sharing the same hard drive, you have to be careful about what you're doing. That's why we did all that stuff, right? I'll walk you through the installation process. And here it shows 6.0.12. So let's see, back here, we're talking about 6.1.0. Now, just a few pages later, they're already on to 6.0.12. We keep going, you'll see even later versions, right? The important thing is that as they were preparing this book and going to press, there were new versions that came out. One thing you want to do is make sure that your host remains up to date and that your VirtualBox is up to date. Otherwise, your virtual machines won't run very well. This walks you through the same set of screens you'd see with 6.1.36, and it's the same thing you're going to do for 1.4. You'll see in just a minute how that works. Well, actually, I'm not going to show you that. It's the same as what you see on the screen. It'll say, hey, this might disrupt your network while you're doing it, and it does for just a second. There's a hiccup, and then the networking goes, and then it loads, and then it's important to install the extension pack. Now, the extension pack makes your own specific hardware work better with VirtualBox. So all you have to do is double click, and it'll say, hey, you have an old version, or it'll say, hey, do you want to install? And you click install. Either way, if you have an old version, you download the new version, or if you don't have any version loaded at all, see here, now you see 6.0.14. So as they continued to write the book, there were new versions that kept rolling out, which is why we're on 36 now. Okay, any questions? All right, we're going to save chapter 3 about the VirtualBox interface for another time. We're going to cover that next week. What I want to do is walk through the setup of a virtual machine using the download media. And I want to show you where you put this information, right? So if you did what we asked you to do last week, you would have had, and if you fulfilled the assignment, it's the 1.2 assignment, in your solutions, you'd have in module 1, the license keys. You'd have the license keys. Yeah, everybody remembers we covered this, right? Everybody remembers this? Yes? No? Maybe?
Nope.
I got to get my license keys. I wasn't in class last week.
Okay.
Same.
So we went to the My Campus portal and then went to the, yeah, if you click here, this YouTube, we did this in class, yeah. Oh, wait a minute. I got to fix that. No, that's the host optimization. Let me fix that real quick. I'm going to fix that so that when you click, it doesn't give you a hard time. I'm surprised nobody said anything.
The optimizing?
Yeah.
I thought, you see, I had a feeling something was off. Okay.
All right. So what we're going to do, yeah, we're going to change this up a bit, right? Okay. So now it'll work. I'm talking about this one. This link walks you through the required steps to download and then the license keys. And toward the end of the class, last week, this was our class. Remember this? Is this ringing a bell?
No, I wasn't in class last week.
Okay. Well, if you weren't in class last week, the good news is this is part of what you need to do. So you have the license activation key that's unique for you. That's really important because the key that works for you doesn't work for other people. Once you download the thing, you need to put the install media in a temp folder. So in downloads, I have a very large file, and when I want to use it, I want to put it in a temp folder on the C drive. And if you don't have a temp folder created yet, you want to do that. That's not hard to do. You just click on C, and then you right click with your right mouse, and you go to New, and then Folder, and give it the name temp with a capital T, okay? Any questions about that?
No.
So there's my install media. Now, as soon as I finish installing this, I can get rid of it or keep a copy of it. But let's say that I choke and I can't install this by the end of class. Let's say I try to do this in 3 or 4 minutes because it's a very fast process. And let's say that I don't have enough space. I need 36 gigs of space, but it does some calculations and it says, hey, you still don't have enough space. There is another kind of operating system, and I'm going to create a separate link where you can download a Linux operating system called Debian. And you can set it up and walk through the same thing. It takes a lot less space, 1/4 the space. If you have a laptop that only has 10, 15 gigs free, even after you do all of the steps to optimize your technology, you can use you can use the other option to install and set up a virtual machine instead of setting up the standard server, okay? And so that's what we're going to do next. For your solution, here's how it's going to look. So we're going to minimize all our stuff. I'm going to run virtual machine. I'm going to run VirtualBox, and I'm going to right click it and run as administrator because I want it to do everything it's supposed to do to work right. And I'm going to leave this here because it says, oh, I don't see that, but that's all right. I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call this Win SRV STD. Okay, everybody with me? Win SRV STD, no spaces. And I'm going to put it in the VM folder, a dedicated folder on my machine. Now, if you have Microsoft Office 365 set up on your laptop and it uses the documents folder, this is critical. You're going to want to set this up before you do something. But then look, as soon as I typed Win, it knew that it was a Windows operating system. What I need to do is hit the pull down and find the closest thing to 2022, which would be 2019. I'm going to hit next. I have 12 gigs of RAM on my laptop. I'm going to give this 6 gigs of RAM. I'm going to give it half the RAM I use so that when it's installing, it's going to go fast, right? So I'm going to increase that. You may not have 6 gigs of RAM. I'm going to create a virtual hard disk now. And I'm going to create that. I'll accept the setting here. I'm going to make it fixed. I don't want it dynamic. I want it fixed, and I want to make it 36 gigs large. So I'm going to change this to 36. So everybody see what I'm doing?
Yes.
I hit create. It's going to create the virtual hard disk. And as it creates the virtual hard disk, it's going to suck up 36 gigabytes of space because it's going to build that virtual hard disk and reserve 36 gigabytes. So I'm going to have 2.9 gigabytes left on my laptop. So I'm really pushing it. In 1 minute and 45 seconds, it'll be done. And then it's going to ask me some other questions about the rest of it, right? I can just accept the defaults that come up. And when I accept the defaults and click and create, I should be able to run it. When I run it, it's going to ask me, wait a second, where's your Windows? It's going to say that it can't start, it can't boot. And that's because it's also creating a virtual DVD drive. And let me repeat that. As this virtual machine is building, it is creating a virtual DVD drive. And it's going to ask me to choose where my disk is. I know where my disk is. My disk is in the temp folder. And I'm going to select this disk to load into my disk, my DVD disk tray. At that point, when I try to start my machine, it'll launch as if I put a physical DVD disk in a physical DVD drive tray. And then it'll say, hey, do you want to set up Windows? And off I go. The same process is true when I set up with Debian. The virtual machine is going to build more than just the hard disk. It's going to build out a virtual CPU, a virtual network card, a virtual graphics controller and display adapter, a virtual screen to work with, a virtual keyboard and a mouse. It's going to create all those different resources, and they're all going to be they're all going to be virtual representations of a real machine. But it's going to, when you go to power it on, it's going to be like a brand new piece of hardware with nothing loaded on it. It's going to say, hey, I can't boot this machine. I can't start it up. Where is your, how do you want to start this? And you say, okay, I'm going to put a disk in the tray, the install media disk. And that's when you point it to this download instead of the server, the Microsoft server download. Now, what I've done is showed you what you need to get started. There will be a separate recording that you can follow. The recording was performed last year, but it's the same set of steps. The only difference is that instead of 2019, it's 2022, okay? We'll put that link out there along with the solution, and you'll see it inside here under assignment 1.3. Okay, it'll be right down here. And how did I get into here? I clicked here and then went right there. Are there any questions about what we've shared today?